What would you do if one night a baby was left on your doorstep? No note, no explanation. Just a tiny life placed in your hands. This is exactly what happened to Margaret Coleman, and what followed would change her life in ways she never could have imagined. Over 25 years later, the baby she adopted grew into a determined woman with an incredible plan to change lives. Together, they were about to transform a heartbreaking beginning into a story of hope, family, and unbreakable bonds. You won't believe how this mother-daughter duo turned a moment of fate into a lifelong legacy. Before we dive into this heartwarming journey, take a moment to share where you're watching from in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring stories. The evening had settled into a peaceful stillness, only interrupted by the rhythmic ticking of the wall clock. Margaret Coleman, a 50-year-old woman whose face bore the marks of a lifetime's worth of experiences, sat in her modest Richmond, Virginia home. It had been a long day at the community center where she worked, tirelessly helping families navigate their struggles. Her heart ached for the people she encountered, but tonight, she was grateful for the quiet. Or so she thought. Suddenly, the sharp ring of the doorbell shattered the silence. Margaret's heart skipped a beat. It was well past 10 p.m. Who could possibly be at her door at this hour? She frowned, her hands hesitating on the doorknob. There were no sounds outside, no shifting shadows beneath the streetlights. With a cautious breath, she opened the door, her brow furrowing as her eyes adjusted to the dim light. And there she was, a tiny bundle, wrapped in a worn white sheet, resting at her doorstep. Margaret's heart stopped. Her mind raced, struggling to comprehend what she was seeing. A baby, pale, delicate, and impossibly small, lying there, barely moving, save for the faint rise and fall of her chest. Tiny fingers peeked out from the folds of the sheet, and wisps of light hair framed her flushed cheeks. Margaret's throat tightened. She knelt down, gently lifting the child into her arms. She was so light, barely a weight in Margaret's grasp. Yet in that moment, it felt as if the entire world had been placed in her hands. The child's eyes fluttered open for a brief second, locking with Margaret's, and in that fleeting gaze, something shifted deep inside her. There was no note, no explanation, no sign of who might have left the baby or why. The street outside was eerily empty, save for a few parked cars. Margaret stood there for a long moment, cradling the baby against her chest, feeling the soft rhythm of her breathing. "What am I supposed to do?" she whispered, her voice trembling. She knew the answer, of course. Her first instinct was to call social services. But as the seconds stretched into minutes, she couldn't bring herself to dial the number. The thought of this innocent child being swallowed by the system, lost in a sea of paperwork and strangers, made a knot tighten in her stomach. She'd seen it happen too many times before. Looking down at the baby again, Margaret was struck by how peaceful she seemed, as if, somehow, she already trusted Margaret. The woman brushed her fingers gently across the baby's soft cheek, feeling her warmth. "I can't let you go," Margaret whispered. And so, she took the baby inside. Her mind was swirling, overwhelmed by the whirlwind of emotions and possibilities. She wasn't prepared for this. Her life had not gone as planned. The dream of having her own family had been buried long ago, lost to an illness in her late 30s that had stolen her chance at motherhood. But now this felt like a second chance. The authorities came the next day. They asked their questions, but no one could explain where the child had come from or who had left her. There were no reports of a missing child, matching the baby's description. It was as if she had appeared out of thin air. After a few weeks of uncertainty and back and forth with social services, Margaret made a life-altering decision. She would keep the baby. She would adopt her. The process was long, filled with doubt at times. But with each passing day, Margaret grew more certain that this child, this beautiful, fragile little girl, was meant to be with her. She named her Sarah. The early years were challenging. Margaret had never raised a child before, and the shift from her quiet routine to sleepless nights and constant worry was overwhelming. But there was joy too. Joy in the laughter that filled their home. Joy in the tiny footsteps that followed Margaret everywhere. Joy in the simple act of holding Sarah close when she cried. Her friends questioned her decision. "You're 50, they'd say. Are you sure you're ready for this?" But Margaret knew in her heart that she was ready. maybe not in the way they meant, but in a way that mattered most. Sarah was a bright, inquisitive child, and she never questioned why her skin was different from her mother's. To her, Margaret was simply Mom, and that was all that mattered. They lived a simple life in Richmond, with Margaret continuing her work at the community center, helping families facing the same struggles she knew all too well. The years passed, and Sarah grew into a compassionate young woman, inheriting her mother's deep empathy. She often volunteered at shelters and orphanages, and Margaret watched her with pride, knowing they had built a life together, a family bound by love, not blood. Then, one warm summer afternoon, Sarah, now 26, sat across from Margaret at the small kitchen table they had shared for as long as Sarah could remember. The sunlight filtered through the curtains, casting a soft glow on the table where they'd shared countless meals. Margaret, now 76, moved a little slower, but her spirit was as vibrant as ever. "I've been thinking a lot lately," Sarah began, her voice hesitant but full of determination. Margaret looked up from her cup of tea, sensing that something important was coming. "What is it, sweetheart?" she asked gently. Sarah took a deep breath, her eyes locking with Margaret's. "I want to open a children's home." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected this. "A children's home? For kids who've been abandoned or lost," Sarah continued. "Kids like me. I want to give them a place where they feel safe, where they know they're loved, just like you did for me." Margaret's throat tightened. Her eyes welled up. She had always known Sarah had a special heart, but hearing her speak those words filled her with a mix of awe and pride. "I want you to help me run it," Sarah added, her voice softening. Margaret blinked, taken aback. "Me?" "Yes, Mom," Sarah interrupted, reaching across the table to take Margaret's hands in hers. "You've always wanted a big family. I know you never had the chance because of what happened. But you gave me a family. Now I want us to do this together, helping these kids. You can be like a mother to them, too." Tears welled up in Margaret's eyes. She had never spoken much about her unfulfilled dream of a large family, but Sarah had always known. And now, she was offering Margaret a chance to fulfill that dream in a way she had never imagined. "I don't know what to say," Margaret whispered, her voice trembling with emotion. "Say yes," Sarah urged, her smile soft but filled with hope. "We can do this together." For a moment, Margaret sat there, overwhelmed by the weight of the moment. She had always felt Sarah was a gift, an unexpected blessing that had filled the void in her life. And now, after all these years, Sarah was giving her another gift, one that would allow them to touch even more lives. Margaret squeezed Sarah's hands, a tear slipping down her cheek. "Yes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Let's do it." And so the children's home, which they named Coleman's Hope, was born. It wasn't easy. There were challenges, funding issues, red tape, and the emotional toll of caring for children who had been through so much. But through it all, Margaret and Sarah stood strong. Margaret found herself rejuvenated by the work. Her body may have slowed, but her heart was full. Each child that came through their doors became part of their growing family, and Margaret loved them as if they were her own. Sarah too flourished in her role. She became a beacon of hope for the children, offering them the same compassion and care that Margaret had once given her. Together, they were creating a legacy, one that would change lives forever. Together, Margaret and Sarah had created something extraordinary, a legacy that would endure far beyond their own lives. It wasn't just a home. It was a sanctuary, a testament to their dedication, a place where hope could blossom anew. One evening, after the children had drifted off to sleep, Margaret and Sarah found themselves on the porch of their beloved home, watching as the sun slowly sank behind the vast fields. The warm air wrapped around them like a comforting embrace, and the soft hum of cicadas filled the quiet moments. Margaret gazed at the horizon, her voice a mere whisper. "I never thought I'd have this," she said, her eyes fixed on the fading light. "A family like this." Sarah, leaning her head gently on her mother's shoulder, smiled, her heart full. "You always had a family, Mom. You had me." Margaret's hand rested softly on Sarah's head, a surge of love swelling in her chest. "And I'll always have you." As the sun dipped lower, casting the world in a golden hue, Margaret closed her eyes, breathing in the stillness. She had spent so many years searching for purpose, for meaning, And now, as the evening wrapped around them, she realized she had found it. Not just in the children she had helped but in Sarah. Her daughter had saved her, just as much as she had saved that tiny baby all those years ago. But their journey wasn't over. It stretched on with each new child that came through the doors of Coleman's Hope. A journey defined by love, second chances, and a family bound not by blood but by the deepest connection. As the years passed, Coleman's Hope blossomed from a humble home into a vibrant sanctuary. The community embraced the mission, recognizing the tireless efforts of Sarah and Margaret. Donations poured in, volunteers rallied, and the home became a beacon of hope for those in need. Now in her 80s, Margaret had slowed down, her body feeling the weight of years of hard work. Yet her heart was more alive than ever. Every child that passed through the doors of Coleman's Hope found in Margaret a wellspring of warmth, comfort, and wisdom. Her once small home now rang with the laughter and chatter of children, just as she had always dreamed. But even the brightest dreams had their shadows. One autumn, disaster struck. A sharp economic downturn left the home struggling. Donations dried up, and they teetered on the edge of closing their doors. The pressure mounted on Sarah, and Margaret, seeing the strain on her daughter, felt a pang of helplessness. She had always been the strong one, the one who shouldered the weight of the world. But now it was Sarah who carried that burden. Margaret could only watch as her daughter, now in her 50s, struggled under the weight of running the home and managing the mounting financial crisis. One evening, as they sat in the office, poring over the numbers, Sarah let out a heavy sigh. "I don't know if we can make it through this," she said, her voice filled with exhaustion. Margaret reached across the table, her hand steady and firm. "We will," she said with conviction. "We've come too far to give up now." Sarah looked up, her eyes clouded with doubt. "But how, Mom? We're barely staying afloat." Margaret smiled, her voice filled with the wisdom of a lifetime. "Because we've been through worse, haven't we? And every time, we've come out stronger. This is just another challenge, and we'll face it like we always have, together." Tears welled up in Sarah's eyes, but she nodded, her resolve hardening. "You're right, Mom. We'll find a way." And Sarah did. She reached out, organizing fundraising events, speaking at community centers, and calling upon local businesses for support. Slowly, the word spread, and the town rallied around them once again. Then one day, just as Sarah was preparing for a fundraising event, a surprise visitor appeared at the door. An older man, sharp in a crisp suit, stood there, his face vaguely familiar. "Miss Coleman," he said, his voice smooth and polite. Sarah paused, trying to place him. "Yes, that's me," she replied, curiosity rising. The man smiled warmly, extending his hand. "I'm Greg Franklin. I was once a resident here, about 20 years ago." Sarah's eyes widened in recognition. "Greg Franklin? I remember you. You were just a boy when you came here." Greg nodded, a soft smile tugging at his lips. "That's right. And I've never forgotten this place. You and your mother, you changed my life. I came here with nothing, and you gave me a home, a chance." Tears sprang to Sarah's eyes. "It was our honor, Greg. I'm so glad to see you again." Greg's smile deepened. "I heard about the troubles you're facing, and I wanted to help." Before Sarah could respond, Greg pulled an envelope from his coat pocket and handed it to her. "It's not much, but I hope it helps keep Coleman's Hope running." Sarah opened the envelope, her breath catching. Inside was a check for $50,000. Her hands trembled as she looked up at Greg, overwhelmed with gratitude. Greg shrugged modestly. "You don't have to say anything. You saved my life when I was just a kid. This is the least I can do." Tears rolled down Sarah's cheeks as she wiped them away. "Thank you. Thank you so much." Greg nodded, giving her a warm hug before leaving, promising to stay in touch. As Sarah watched him walk away, she felt a renewed sense of hope. The home had given so much to so many, and now, one of those children had returned to give back. In the years that followed, Coleman's Hope continued to thrive, fueled by the love and dedication of Sarah and Margaret, as well as the unwavering support of the community. Every child who came through the doors wasn't just a resident, they were family. Margaret, now in her late 80s, remained the heart of the home. She became a grandmother to all the children, beloved and cherished for her warmth, her stories, and her wisdom. One evening, As Sarah and Margaret sat together on the porch, watching the sunset, they reflected on the journey they had traveled together. "We've been through a lot, haven't we?" Margaret said softly, her voice filled with nostalgia. Sarah nodded, her heart swelling with love. "We have. And we've built something beautiful here." Margaret smiled, her eyes twinkling with pride. "You've done more than I ever could have dreamed, Sarah. I'm so proud of you." Sarah's heart ached with affection. "I couldn't have done it without you, Mom. You showed me what it means to love, to care for others. You're the reason Coleman's Hope exists." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. "You gave me a family when I thought I'd never have one. And now, you've given me a family bigger than I could have ever imagined." "I love you, Mom," Sarah whispered, pulling her mother into a tight embrace. "I love you too, sweetheart." As they sat there together, watching the sun dip below the horizon, Margaret felt a deep sense of peace. She had spent her life searching for meaning for family, and now, in this moment, she realized she had found it. Not just in Sarah, but in every child who had walked through the doors of Coleman's Hope. Her legacy, her love, would live on long after she was gone. Years later, Sarah found herself sitting on the same porch, but this time, she wasn't alone. A young boy, no more than 6 years old, sat beside her. His legs swung off the edge of the step, and his small voice broke the stillness. "Miss Sarah," he asked, his tone soft and curious, "do you think I'll have a family one day?" Sarah smiled warmly, her heart swelling with compassion. She had been asked this question by so many children, but the answer was always the same. "You already do," she said gently. "You're part of Coleman's Hope, and that means you have a family right here. We're all in this together, and we'll always be here for you." The boy's face lit up with a smile. His worries eased as he scooted closer to Sarah, resting his head against her arm. "Thanks, Miss Sarah." "You're welcome, sweetheart," Sarah replied, her heart full. And so, as they sat together, watching the sun set once more over the fields, Sarah felt a deep sense of fulfillment. She had carried on her mother's legacy, and now, a new generation was becoming part of the family they had built. The story of Coleman's Hope continued, a story of love, second chances, and the kind of family that goes beyond blood. Margaret's dream had become a reality, and Sarah had taken that dream, making it even bigger, even more beautiful. The home would continue to welcome children, offering them safety, love, and hope. And in the hearts of every child who walked through its doors, Margaret's love would live on forever. The words hung in the air, heavier than any spoken sentence could ever be. Sarah broke the peaceful silence with a question that had been gnawing at her heart for years. "Do you ever wonder, Mom," she began, her voice soft but full of emotion, "what would have happened if you hadn't found me on that doorstep?" Margaret slowly turned her head, her gaze meeting her daughter's. Despite the wear of time etched into her face, her eyes still carried that unmistakable glimmer of love that had always been there. "I try not to think about what could have been," Margaret replied, her voice steady yet tinged with the wisdom of years lived. "What matters is what did happen." Sarah smiled, a soft, wistful expression. Her mother's words rang true, but there was still something about the way their lives had unfolded that seemed almost miraculous. "It just amazes me sometimes," Sarah murmured, "how everything turned out." Margaret's lips curved into a faint, knowing smile. "Life's funny like that," she said. "You can't predict it, and you certainly can't control it. But sometimes, when you least expect it, it gives you exactly what you need." Sarah reached over and gently squeezed her mother's hand, feeling the steady warmth in the touch. She had always admired Margaret's strength, her resilience in the face of so many struggles. Through loss, loneliness, and missed opportunities, Margaret had never been broken. Instead, she had poured everything into Sarah, into every child who found a home at Coleman's Hope. Sarah had grown up with that love, that unwavering commitment, and she had carried it with her into adulthood. They sat in a comfortable silence, the breeze whispering through the trees. The children were outside, their laughter filling the air, a constant reminder of the life Margaret had built. The world seemed to pause around them, and Margaret, though frail in body, felt a swelling pride in her heart. The legacy she had crafted with Sarah would endure, living on in every life it touched. As the sun began to set, casting a soft golden light over the horizon, Margaret's voice broke the silence once more, faint and fragile. "I'm tired, Sarah," she whispered, her words barely audible. Sarah's heart clenched as she turned toward her mother, her own voice thick with emotion. "I know, Mom," she said, her throat tight. Margaret took a slow, deliberate breath, her chest rising and falling as though savoring the moments that remained. "I'm ready," she said, her tone quiet yet resolute. "I've had a good life. I've loved and I've been loved. That's all I ever wanted." Tears sprang to Sarah's eyes, but she blinked them away quickly. She knew her mother wouldn't want her to cry, not now. "I love you, Mom. I always will," she said, her voice trembling with the weight of the moment. Margaret's smile was faint, but it was enough. In that brief, perfect moment, it felt as if time itself paused, suspended in the quiet bond between mother and daughter. "I love you too, Sarah," Margaret whispered, barely more than a breath. And with that, she closed her eyes for the last time, her hand still held firmly in Sarah's. The days that followed Margaret's passing blurred into one another. Life at Coleman's Hope continued. Children still played. Meals were still served. The routine never wavered. But Sarah felt the void in every corner of the house, in every quiet moment. Her mother was gone, and with her, a part of Sarah's heart had disappeared. The funeral was simple, just as Margaret had requested. Close friends, former residents, and community members came to honor her memory. Stories were shared, laughter mixed with tears, and Margaret's life was celebrated for the love and purpose it had embodied. But for Sarah, there was no replacing her mother. Margaret had been her anchor, her guide, and her greatest source of strength. Without her, Sarah felt unmoored, unsure of how to carry on. One evening, as Sarah sat alone in the office, going through paperwork, a soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts. She looked up to see a young woman standing hesitantly in the doorway, a small envelope clutched in her hand. "Miss Coleman?" the woman asked, her voice tentative but kind. "Yes, that's me," Sarah replied, setting her pen aside. The woman stepped forward, handing her the envelope with a quiet grace. "I don't mean to intrude, but I wanted to give you this. It's a letter from my mother," the woman explained softly. "She was one of the children who lived here many years ago." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She had received many letters over the years, each one a reminder of how Margaret had touched so many lives. With trembling fingers, she accepted the envelope and opened it. The letter inside was simple but filled with raw emotion. "Dear Sarah, I don't know if you remember me, but I was one of the children your mother took in many years ago. I just wanted to let you know that, because of your mother, I was able to go on to live a good life. I have a family of my own now, and I think of her often, especially when I look at my children. She gave me hope when I had none, and for that, I will always be grateful. Please know that her legacy lives on in all of us who were lucky enough to be part of her family. Thank you for continuing her work and giving so many of us the chance to build better lives. I hope you find comfort in knowing that your mother made a difference in this world. With love, a grateful daughter." Sarah's eyes filled with tears as she read the words, her heart swelling with a mixture of sorrow and pride. She had always known her mother's impact was profound, but seeing it in writing, in the heartfelt words of someone whose life had been changed, brought new depth to her grief. Margaret had touched lives in ways she couldn't have imagined. After a moment, Sarah folded the letter and placed it gently on her desk. She wiped her eyes and took a steadying breath. Her mother was gone, but her legacy would not fade. Coleman's Hope would continue, as it always had, a place of love, healing, and second chances. And Sarah would carry on Margaret's work, knowing that she was never truly alone. Margaret's spirit would live on in every child who passed through those doors. As the years passed, Coleman's Hope continued to grow. Sarah, now in her 60s, had become a well-respected figure in the community. The children's home expanded thanks to the generosity of former residents and supporters, and Sarah was able to step back from the day-to-day operations, though she remained deeply involved in the lives of the children. On the anniversary of Margaret's passing, a special ceremony was held. Former residents gathered to honor her, sharing stories of how Margaret had changed their lives. The day was filled with laughter, tears, and memories, an outpouring of love for the woman who had given so much to so many. As the sun set on that day, Sarah stood in the garden, gazing out over the home that had come to define her life's work. She thought of her mother, the night she had found her on that doorstep, the journey they had shared. A sense of peace washed over her. Margaret's dream had become a reality, and it had grown into something even bigger than either of them could have imagined. The home was thriving, and Sarah knew that it would continue to do so, just as Margaret had always hoped. Years later, when Sarah retired, Coleman's hope was in the capable hands of a new generation of leaders, many of whom had once been children at the home. Sarah spent her retirement traveling, writing, and visiting the home whenever she could. She never lost touch with the children, always finding ways to stay connected to the place that had been her life's purpose. One particularly beautiful spring day, as she sat on a bench in the garden, watching the children play, she felt a deep sense of fulfillment. The journey had been long, and at times difficult, but Sarah knew it had been worth every step. She closed her eyes, the laughter of the children filling her ears, and smiled. Margaret's dream had not only come true, it had flourished. And Sarah knew without a doubt that wherever her mother was, she was smiling too.